Hi everyone, welcome to our podcast. Today we're diving into Sam Harris' The Moral Landscape, which was published in 2010. It's a bold work that argues science can answer moral questions. John, why don't you kick things off with the first key takeaway?
Sure thing, Alice. So Harris starts by saying that moral truths exist and science can help us find them by examining human well-being. He challenges the idea that there's this strict divide between facts and values. Basically, just like science can determine what's physically healthy, it can also explore what leads to human flourishing. What struck me is how he believes there are objective truths in morality, even if we can't always reach perfect answers.
Exactly. He really drives that point home with the concept of the moral landscape, where you have these peaks and valleys representing different states of well-being and suffering for conscious creatures. Some societies might be on higher peaks, promoting well-being, while others, like those that suppress women or allow slavery, are stuck in valleys of suffering. He's saying there's an objective difference between those states.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because Harris argues that multiple peaks can exist, meaning there might be different ways for societies to reach high levels of well-being. But the valleys of suffering are clear and can be universally recognized. What did you think of his critique on religious beliefs, Alice?
Oh, that's where Harris really ruffles some feathers. He argues that religious beliefs aren't immune to scientific scrutiny. He calls out institutions like the Catholic Church for their historical actions not aligning with their supposed moral authority. But it's not just an attack on religion. He acknowledges that spiritual experiences can be studied scientifically. It's the claims about reality, like miracles or moral edicts, that he says should be questioned based on their impact on human well-being.
And speaking of well-being, he tackles the tricky topic of free will next. Harris argues that free will is an illusion based on neuroscientific evidence showing that our decisions are shaped by factors we're not consciously aware of. It kind of blows up the traditional concept of moral responsibility, but Harris doesn't suggest we just throw responsibility out the window.
Right. He makes a good point that understanding we don't have free will can actually lead to a more compassionate and productive approach to ethics and justice. Instead of focusing on punishment, we can prioritize rehabilitation and prevention. It's about improving society rather than simply blaming individuals for things they may not have consciously controlled.
That ties into his discussion on belief formation, which I found really eye-opening. He explains how unconscious processes and biases shape our moral convictions. It's not just rational thought guiding our beliefs. Our upbringing, emotions, and even brain chemistry play huge roles.
Totally. And it's so important to realize that many of our biases are outside our control. But awareness of those biases is the first step toward overcoming them. Harris stresses the importance of critical thinking and being open to revising our beliefs, especially in moral discussions.
That awareness also extends to understanding psychopathy, which Harris uses as an example of how neurological differences can lead to moral deficits. Studies of psychopaths reveal that brain structure and function impact their ability to process empathy and make moral decisions. It supports the idea that morality has a biological basis.
And the implications of that are huge, not just for understanding morality, but also for our justice system. Instead of treating psychopathy purely as a moral failing, Harris argues that we should consider the biological factors involved and focus on rehabilitation where possible.
Which leads us to another bold challenge Harris presents. He takes on the traditional notion of the soul. Advances in neuroscience show that all aspects of our mental life, consciousness, emotions, and even moral reasoning, are products of brain function. He says this undermines the idea of a soul separate from the brain, pushing us to reframe ethical debates in terms of what's empirically observable.
Yeah. He's really shifting the focus from metaphysical explanations to scientific ones. If our moral decisions are tied to brain activity, then improving mental health and well-being becomes a matter of empirical study, not spiritual or religious doctrine. And I think this ties into his criticism of cultural relativism too, doesn't it?
Definitely. Harris takes a strong stance against cultural relativism, which argues that moral truths are only valid within specific cultural contexts. He points out this view can excuse horrible practices, like human rights abuses, under the guise of respecting cultural differences. For Harris, some moral principles, like reducing unnecessary suffering, should be universally applicable.
Absolutely. He's not saying we should ignore cultural diversity, but that we shouldn't shy away from making moral judgments where human well-being is concerned. And that brings us to the final point Harris makes. The ICE-ought distinction. He argues that because science deals with facts doesn't mean we can't derive moral principles from those facts.
Right. Harris uses well-being as a bridge between the is and ought. By focusing on what promotes or hinders the well-being of conscious creatures, we can use scientific evidence to inform ethical decisions. Sure, there's still uncertainty, but he believes science provides the best framework for moral progress.
And on that note, he wraps up by reminding us that happiness and well-being are complex but scientifically approachable. Neuroscience and psychology are already uncovering what contributes to human flourishing, from social connections to mental health. As our understanding grows, Harris believes we'll be able to make more informed decisions on both personal and societal levels.
It's a fascinating read, and whether you agree with Harris or not, his argument for a science-based morality definitely makes you think. We could go on for hours about this book, but for now, that's all the time we have!
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll be back next week with more thought-provoking ideas to discuss. See you then!
Take care and keep exploring those moral landscapes.